She had exactly 3 seconds to decide. 3 seconds to choose between remaining a ghost in a room full of monsters or risking a bullet to save a man who didn't even know she existed. 3 seconds that would bridge the gap between a life of struggle and a world of absolute power. Her name was Laura Titi. To the wealthy elite at the Sapphire Lounge, she was just a shadow in a deep red dress, someone who cleared glasses and stayed silent. She was a brilliant medical student working double shifts, not because she wanted to be a hero, but because she was the only thing standing between her younger brother and the cold reality of the streets. She wasn't looking for a war. She was looking for a way out. But sometimes destiny doesn't ask if you're ready. Sometimes it places you in the path of a predator like Jin Woo, a man whose handsome, sharp features masked the fact that he was the most feared Mafia boss in the city. Tonight, Laura saw something no one else was supposed to see. She saw the vial. She saw the betrayal. And in one heart-pounding moment of clumsy grace, she made a choice that would save a billionaire's life, kill a traitor, and place a target on her own back. This is her story, and I promise you, by the end, you'll realize that the most dangerous person in the room isn't the man with the gun. It's the woman with nothing to lose and the intelligence to change the game. Stay with us. You won't want to miss how a single glass of wine started a revolution. The air in the lounge shifted the second the front doors swung open. It wasn't a loud entrance, but it was a heavy one. The kind that made the bartenders stand a little straighter and the security team press their earpieces closer to their heads. "He's here," someone whispered in the kitchen. Laura didn't need to ask who. She felt the sudden drop in temperature before she saw him. Jin Woo walked in like he owned the oxygen in the room. He was younger than the legends suggested, maybe late 20s, but he carried an intensity that made him look like he'd lived 1,000 lifetimes. His black hair was slicked back, perfectly styled, and his tailored black suit hugged a frame that was clearly built for more than just sitting behind a desk. He was strikingly handsome, with a jawline sharp enough to cut glass, but it was his eyes that stopped people in their tracks. They were dark, hooded, and constantly moving, as if he were calculating the exact cost of every soul in the lounge. Behind him followed a wall of muscle, 4 bodyguards in identical charcoal suits. Among them was a man with a jagged scar running through his eyebrow. He was Jin Woo's right hand, the one everyone called the Shadow. Laura took a deep breath, smoothing her red dress. "Table 1," her manager muttered, his voice trembling slightly. "Only the best. And Laura, don't speak unless he speaks to you. Don't even breathe too loud." She grabbed the gold-trimmed tray and moved toward the VIP booth. As she approached, the conversation at the table died down. Jin Woo sat in the center, his posture relaxed, but his energy radiating a dangerous charisma. He looked up as she set the first glass down. For a split second, his dark eyes locked onto hers. Laura's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her hand steady. She didn't look away, but she didn't stare. She gave him the professional, distant courtesy of a girl who knew her place. "Your usual vintage, Mr. Woo," she said, her voice smooth and low. He didn't answer. He just gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, his gaze lingering on her just a second too long before turning back to his associates. Laura stepped back into the shadows of the pillar, her duty done. But as she watched from the periphery, her medical training kicked in. She wasn't looking at his handsome face anymore, she was looking at the room. She noticed how the Shadow wasn't watching the door like the other guards. He was watching Jin Woo's glass. She noticed the slight tremor in the guard's hand as he reached into his inner vest pocket. The lounge was full of music and laughter, but Laura could hear her own pulse. She saw the movement, a tiny amber vial palmed with professional speed. A drop. Just one. It disappeared into the deep red of the wine. He's going to kill him, she realized. Right here, in front of everyone. Jin Woo reached for the glass, his fingers brushing the stem. Laura's lungs felt like they were collapsing. If she did nothing, the most powerful man in the city would be dead in 60 seconds. If she did something, she might be dead in 10. Malik, she whispered to herself, the name of her brother acting as a prayer. She looked at the glass, then at the traitor, and then at the back of Jin Woo's head. The clock started. 3 seconds. 2. 1. The atmosphere in the Sapphire Lounge didn't just change when the front doors opened. It curdled. It was a heavy, suffocating pressure that made the upbeat jazz music feel suddenly out of tune. Laura felt the hair on her arms stand up before she even turned around. She knew that feeling. It was the feeling of a predator entering the room. "He's here," her manager breathed, his face losing every drop of color. Table 1. Now. Jin Woo didn't walk so much as he glided, cutting through the crowded room like a blade through silk. He was younger than the terrifying stories suggested, likely in his early 30s, but he carried an ancient, dangerous authority. His black hair was slicked back with military precision, framing a face that was almost unfairly handsome. Sharp, aristocratic features, and a jawline that looked like it was carved from granite. He wore a tailored black suit over a crisp white shirt, the top buttons undone to reveal a hint of a powerful athletic build. But it was his eyes that truly paralyzed the room. They were dark, hooded, and utterly cold, scanning the lounge not for entertainment, but for threats. Behind him followed a phalanx of 4 bodyguards, men who looked like they were made of iron and bad intentions. Among them was his lead security detail, a man with a jagged scar through his eyebrow, who stayed just a half step behind his master's shoulder. Laura took a steadying breath, smoothing the fabric of her red dress. "Remember the plan," she whispered to herself. "Stay invisible. Be the shadow." As she approached table 1 with her tray, the surrounding tables went silent. People didn't just stop talking. They leaned away, as if Jin Woo's presence were a physical heat they couldn't endure. She arrived at the booth and began to set down the crystal glasses with practiced, trembling hands. "Your usual vintage, Mr. Woo," she said. Her voice was low and steady, a feat of pure willpower. Jin Woo didn't look at the wine. He looked at her. For 3 long seconds, his intense gaze locked onto hers, searching for something. Fear, perhaps, or a hidden motive. Laura didn't flinch. She kept her expression neutral, the perfect image of a girl who knew how to mind her own business. "You're new," he remarked. His voice was a deep, melodic rasp that sent a shiver down her spine. It wasn't a question. It was an observation from a man who noticed every grain of sand in his desert. "I'm just here to serve, sir," Laura replied, giving a small, respectful tilt of her head before backing away into the dim light of the periphery. She retreated to her station near the marble pillar, but her eyes never left the table. From this distance, she saw the world the way her medical textbooks taught her, not as people, but as systems. She watched the way Jin Woo leaned back, the apex predator at ease. But then she saw the glitch in the system. The bodyguard with the scarred eyebrow wasn't looking at the door. He wasn't watching the crowd. He was staring at Jin Woo's glass. Laura's heart skipped a beat as she saw the guard's hand dip into his vest pocket, moving with a terrifying, practiced speed. In the heartbeat it took for Jin Woo to turn his head to speak to an associate, Laura saw the flash of a small amber vial. A single drop fell. It vanished into the dark, expensive wine like a secret.
The air in Laura's lungs turned to ice. She knew that look. The clinical, detached way the guard watched the liquid settle. This wasn't a robbery. It was an execution. And in less than a minute, the most powerful man in the city would take a sip and never wake up. Laura looked at the exit, then at the table, then thought of Malik waiting for her at home. She had a choice to make, and she had exactly 3 seconds before the glass reached Jinwoo's lips. The silence at table 1 was a living thing, heavy and suffocating. Laura stood paralyzed in the shadows of the marble pillar, her tray clutched so tightly to her chest that the metal edges dug into her palms. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was a witness. Through the haze of the lounge's dim amber lighting, she watched the man they called the Shadow. He was Jinwoo's most trusted protector, the one meant to take a bullet for him. But as he leaned over to adjust a carafe, Laura's eyes, trained by months of diagnostic observation, caught the flicker of something that didn't belong. It was a small, amber vial, no larger than a thumb, palmed with a dexterity that made her stomach churn. The guard's movement was a masterpiece of deception, a quick surgical flick of the wrist, while Jinwoo was distracted by a whispered comment from a business associate. Laura saw the liquid fall. It was thick, almost viscous, disappearing into the dark, expensive wine like a drop of ink in the ocean. Her medical training screamed at her, the way the liquid didn't immediately mix, the slight oily sheen that vanished in a second. It was a neurotoxin, fast-acting, merciless. In less than 60 seconds, Jinwoo's heart would simply stop, and the world would call it a tragic stroke. "Hey, Laura, what are you doing lurking?" Her manager's voice hissed in her ear, making her jump. "Table 9 is waving. Move." I forgot the lemon," she stammered, her voice sounding like it belonged to someone else. Her mind was a hurricane. She looked at the exit. She could walk away. She could go home to Malik, lock the door, and pretend she never saw the serpent in the room. But then she looked at Jinwoo. He was reaching for the glass, his fingers, long, elegant, and steady, wrapped around the crystal stem. He looked so invincible, so in control, and yet he was seconds away from becoming a memory. If she spoke up, the guard would kill her before she finished the sentence. If she did nothing, she was an accomplice to murder. Think, Laura. Think. She looked at the bodyguard. He was watching the glass now, with a predatory hunger, his jaw tight. He wasn't just a traitor, he was a man who enjoyed the kill. Laura's gaze shifted to the table setup. Next to Jinwoo's wine sat the bodyguard's own glass, a tall, condensation-beaded tumbler of sparkling water. They were inches apart. A chaotic blur of a plan began to form, a desperate gamble that required her to be exactly what everyone expected her to be, a clumsy, invisible girl in a red dress. 3 seconds, she whispered under her breath, her heart drumming a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She stepped out of the shadows. The floor felt like it was tilting beneath her feet as she moved toward the center of the storm. The bodyguard saw her coming, and his eyes narrowed, a silent warning to stay back. But Laura didn't stop. She focused on the glass of poisoned wine, the amber vial's ghost still dancing in her vision. She wasn't a hero, she was just a sister who knew that if the city's balance broke tonight, the chaos would swallow people like Malik first. She reached the table just as Jinwoo began to lift the glass to his lips. "Sir, I'm so sorry," she started, her voice intentionally high and frantic. It was time to play the part. It was time to make the switch. The air in the lounge seemed to vibrate as Jinwoo's hand tightened around the stem of the poisoned glass. Laura didn't have time to breathe, let alone second-guess herself. She stepped forward, her tray tilted just enough to catch the light, her heart hammering a rhythm of pure survival. "Sir, I'm so sorry, but there's been a mistake with the order," she said, her voice pitched with a calculated, frantic edge. She didn't wait for him to look up. As she reached the table, Laura stumbled. A perfectly executed trip that sent her leaning heavily toward the booth. Her elbow accidentally clipped the edge of the table, and her tray slid forward with a jarring clatter. In that split second, of manufactured chaos, everything happened at once. The bodyguard with the scarred eyebrows surged forward, his hand flying toward his jacket to draw a weapon, his focus momentarily shattered by the disruption. Jinwoo flinched back, his sharp eyes narrowing as he dropped the glass to avoid the impending collision. "Watch it," the guard snarled, his voice a low, vibrating growl. Laura didn't apologize with words yet. Instead, she let her hands do the work. Amidst the clinking of silverware and the shifting of plates, her fingers moved with the precision of a surgeon. She gripped the stem of the poisoned wine, and in one fluid, invisible motion, slid it 6 inches to the left, straight onto the bodyguard's coaster. Simultaneously, she pulled the guard's tumbler of sparkling water into the space where Jinwoo's wine had been. It was a sleight of hand born of desperation, performed under the gaze of the most dangerous men in the city. I'm so incredibly sorry, Mr. Wu," Laura gasped, her chest heaving as she pulled back, clutching her tray like a shield. She looked down at the table, her eyes wide with faked terror. "I'm so clumsy. Please, let me get you a fresh glass. I'll replace everything immediately." Jinwoo didn't move. He sat perfectly still, his dark eyes boring into Laura as if he were trying to read the very cells of her brain. The tension was a physical weight, a wire pulled so tight it was screaming. He looked at the glass in front of him, the harmless water, and then back at the waitress in the red dress. "It's fine," Jinwoo said, his voice dangerously calm. He reached out, his long fingers wrapping around the water glass Laura had just placed in his path. "Accidents happen, but the next one might be your last." The bodyguard, still simmering with adrenaline and irritation, settled back into his seat. He was annoyed by the interruption, but he was also thirsty. He looked down, seeing a glass of dark red wine sitting exactly where his water had been. In his mind, the clumsy waitress had simply knocked things around in her panic. He didn't want to look weak in front of his boss. He didn't want to draw more attention to the accident. He just wanted to finish the job. "Get lost, girl," the guard muttered, reaching for the wine. Laura backed away, her hands trembling so violently she had to tuck them behind her back. She didn't go far. She retreated into the dim light of the hallway, her lungs burning, her eyes fixed on the man with the scarred eyebrow. She had switched the target. She had moved the death sentence from the man who was her hope for a future to the man who was a snake in the grass. Now, all she could do was watch as the traitor raised the glass to his own lips. "To your health, boss," the guard said, his voice dripping with hidden irony. He took a long, deep swallow, and for a heartbeat, the world stood still. The silence that followed the bodyguard's swallow was heavier than the music thumping in the background. Laura stood in the corridor, her fingers digging into the plastic edges of her tray, her breath hitching in her throat. She didn't look away. She couldn't. At table 1, the man with the scarred eyebrow set the crystal glass back down on the coaster. For 2 seconds, he looked perfectly normal. He wiped a stray drop of wine from his lip and began to turn back toward the door, his hand instinctively reaching for his jacket to readjust his weapon. Then, the glitch happened. His hand froze halfway to his chest. His fingers began to twitch, a rapid, unnatural flutter that looked like a bird trapped under his skin. Laura watched as the color drained from his face, replaced by a terrifying, sickly gray. His eyes, once predatory and sharp, suddenly went wide, the pupils blowing out until they were hollow pits of terror. He tried to speak, but the only sound that escaped was a wet, ragged wheeze. Jinwoo didn't move. He sat perfectly still, his glass of sparkling water halfway to his lips, his dark eyes fixed on his lead guard with a cold, analytical detachment. He didn't reach out to help. He didn't call for a medic. He simply watched the betrayal play out in reverse. The guard's body suddenly jerked. His chair shrieked against the marble floor as his muscles locked in a massive, violent spasm. The wine glass he had just set down was clipped by his flailing arm, shattering into 1,000 glittering shards that sprayed across the table. And then he collapsed. The sound of his skull hitting the floor was like a gunshot. The lounge, which had been a low hum of elite conversation, turned into a vacuum of shocked silence. A woman at the next table let out a piercing scream, and suddenly the vacuum popped. "Call an ambulance," someone shouted. "Security, get back." Jinwoo's other 3 guards reacted instantly, forming a tight, defensive triangle around their boss, their hands disappearing into their jackets. They were looking for a shooter, an assassin, a threat from the outside. They had no idea the poison had come from within their own circle. Through the rising chaos of shouting patrons and rushing staff, Laura stayed rooted to the spot. Her medical mind was screaming. Respiratory failure, neurotoxic shock, cyanosis, but her survival instinct was louder. She saw Jinwoo rise slowly from the booth, stepping over the twitching body of the man who had tried to kill him. He didn't look at his dying guard. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked directly through the chaos, through the flashing lights and the panicked people, until his gaze landed on Laura. His expression wasn't one of shock or fear. It was a terrifyingly calm realization. He looked at the shattered wine glass on the floor, then back at the waitress in the red dress who had tripped just moments before. The weight of his stare felt like a physical blow. Laura realized with a jolt of pure ice in her veins that he knew. He knew she hadn't been clumsy. He knew she had seen the vial. And most importantly, he knew she had chosen who lived and who died. "You," Jinwoo mouthed, his voice lost in the roar of the lounge, but the command in his eyes was unmistakable. The invisible girl had just become the center of a Mafia war, and as Jinwoo began to walk toward her, Laura knew her life as a simple waitress had ended the second that glass hit the floor. The chaos behind her was a storm of shouting and crashing furniture. But Laura didn't look back. She pushed through the heavy double doors of the kitchen, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. The air here smelled of garlic, searing protein, and panic. She needed to disappear. She needed to strip off this red dress, grab her bag, and run until she reached Malik. She reached the employee lockers, her hands shaking so violently she could barely grip the handle. But before she could pull it open, the heavy kitchen door swung wide and slammed against the tiled wall with a sound like a gavel. The kitchen went dead silent. The line cooks froze, knives hovering over cutting boards. Jinwoo stepped into the room. He was alone, having left his wall of bodyguards to deal with the dying man and the panicked socialites. He looked out of place among the stainless steel and industrial vents, a dark, elegant predator in a world of steam and sweat. His gaze swept the room once, dismissing every other person until it landed on Laura. "Out," he said. It wasn't a shout. It was a low, vibrating command that carried the weight of a death sentence. The staff didn't hesitate. They scrambled for the exits, dropping towels and ladles in their haste to escape the gravity of his presence. Within seconds, the only sounds were the hum of the industrial refrigerators and the frantic thrumming of Laura's heart. Jinwoo walked toward her, his footsteps slow and deliberate. He stopped just inches away, invading her personal space until she could smell the faint scent of expensive sandalwood and the metallic tang of the lounge's tension. He reached out, his long, powerful fingers gripping her chin, forcing her to look up into those dark, bottomless eyes. "The girl in the red dress," he murmured, his voice a dangerous caress. "The clumsy waitress who doesn't know how to walk." Laura tried to swallow, but her throat was like sandpaper. I told you, sir. I'm sorry about the accident." Jinwoo's grip tightened, not enough to bruise, but enough to show her that escape was an illusion. A thin, cold smile touched his lips, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You didn't trip, Laura."
I watched your feet. You didn't slip. You pivoted, like someone who knew exactly where the weight needed to fall. He leaned closer, his shadow swallowing her whole. You saw him. You saw what he did to the wine, and you decided that my life was worth more than his. Why? "I don't know what you're talking about," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Liars don't survive in my world," he countered, his gaze dropping to her hands, which were still stained with the faint, invisible residue of the glass she had swapped. "You have the eyes of a scholar and the nerves of a killer. You knew that neurotoxin would hit his heart in 30 seconds. You didn't just save me. You executed a traitor in the middle of a crowded room without firing a single shot." He let go of her chin, but he didn't move back. He reached into his vest pocket, pulling out a sleek black smartphone. He tapped the screen and turned it toward her. It was a live feed of the lounge, and Laura saw 3 men in dark coats standing by the employee exit, waiting. "They think you were his accomplice," Jinwoo said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "They think you killed him to cover your tracks. If you walk out that door, you're a dead woman. If you stay with me, you're a target." He tucked the phone away and held out a hand, not as a gesture of kindness, but as an ultimatum. "The invisible life you loved is over, Laura. Now you have to choose again. Do you want to die as a waitress, or live as the woman who saved the dragon?" The transition from the sterile kitchen to the armored SUV was a blur of shadows and engine roars. Laura pressed her forehead against the bulletproof glass, her breath fogging the window as the city lights streaked by like dying stars. Beside her, Jinwoo sat in a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at his phone, his thumb flicking across the screen with cold, calculated precision as he redirected his remaining loyalists. "Where are we going?" Laura finally whispered, her voice cracking. "I have to get to my brother. Malik is home alone. If you go home, he dies," Jinwoo interrupted, his voice flat. "The men who planned tonight's failure don't leave loose ends. Right now, your apartment is a trap. My men are already moving your brother. If you want him to keep breathing, you stay with me." The vehicle eventually pulled into a nondescript underground garage beneath a luxury high-rise that didn't appear on any tourist maps. This was the safe house, a fortress of glass and steel hidden in plain sight. As the heavy gates hissed shut behind them, Laura felt the finality of it. The girl who studied anatomy in a cramped bedroom was gone. Inside the penthouse, the air was chilled and smelled of ozone. Jinwoo threw his jacket onto a leather sofa and turned to a wall of monitors displaying thermal feeds of the surrounding streets. "They'll be looking for a waitress," he said, pouring 2 fingers of amber liquid into a glass. Pure water this time. "They won't be looking for a ghost." Laura didn't sit. Her survival instincts, honed by years of navigating the city's dangerous red zones to get to school, were screaming. She walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows, but instead of admiring the view, she looked at the locks. She looked at the angles of the furniture. She looked at the heavy medical kit tucked into an open cabinet in the corner. "You're checking the exits," Jinwoo observed, a hint of genuine curiosity in his dark eyes. "I'm checking the vulnerabilities," Laura corrected him, her medical mind taking over. She pointed to the ventilation grate. "If they can't get through the door, they'll use the air. And that medical kit? It's stocked for trauma, but you don't have enough atropine. If they use the same neurotoxin your guard had, those bandages won't save you." Jinwoo paused, the glass halfway to his lips. He looked at the kit, then back at the woman in the torn red dress. He had expected a trembling victim. Instead, he was looking at a strategist. "You're not just a student," he murmured, stepping closer until the heat from his body radiated against her. "You see the world as a series of failures waiting to happen. I see the world as something that needs to be stitched back together," Laura countered, her gaze steady. But I can't stitch anything if we're dead. You have the guns, Jinwoo, but I know how the body breaks. If we're going to survive the next 48 hours, you need to stop treating me like a liability and start treating me like the only person who knows how to keep your heart beating. Jinwoo stared at her for a long moment, the dangerous charisma that defined him softening into something resembling respect. He realized then that he hadn't just saved a waitress, he had recruited a partner who was just as lethal, in her own way, as any soldier in his syndicate. The gambit had begun. The transition from the safe house back into the world didn't happen with a bang, but with the scratching of a fountain pen against the thick, cream-colored paper. The war within the syndicate had ended as quickly as it had begun. A surgical strike led by Jin Woo, guided by the intel Laura had gathered from the shadows of that high-rise apartment. But as the dust settled, Laura found herself standing in Jin Woo's private office. The red dress long replaced by a simple professional suit he had provided. She was ready to walk away. She had her brother back, and they were safe. But as she turned to leave, Jin Woo cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the minimalist room. "You're a difficult woman to thank, Laura Titi," he said, his voice regaining that melodic, dangerous rasp. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at a ledger on his mahogany desk. "You didn't want money. You didn't want a position in the organization. You didn't even want a new car." "I just want my life back," Laura said softly, her hand on the door handle. "I want to go back to being invisible." Jin Woo looked up then, his dark eyes intense. "We both know that's impossible. You've seen the sun. You can't go back to living in the dark. Besides, I don't like being in debt, and I owe you a life." He slid a heavy manila envelope across the desk. Laura hesitated, then stepped back into the room and opened it. Her breath hitched. Inside wasn't a stack of cash, but a series of official documents. There was a deed to a small, secure house in a quiet neighborhood near the university, a place where Malik could have a yard and a front door that didn't require 3 locks. Beneath that was a receipt for a wire transfer that made her heart stop. "Your student loans," Jin Woo explained, leaning back in his chair, "and the tuition for the next 3 years of medical school. Fully paid, no strings, no interest, no favors owed to the Mafia." Laura looked at the papers, then back at him, her eyes stinging. "Why?" "Because the world has enough killers, Laura. It needs more people who know how to stitch it back together," he said, repeating her own words back to her. A rare, genuine smile flickered on his sharp features. "Consider your past debt to the world settled. From now on, you don't work for tips. You work for the title I know you'll earn." He stood up, walking toward her until he was just a breath away. He reached out, not to grab her chin this time, but to offer a respectful hand. "Go become Dr. Titi. And Laura, don't ever be invisible again. The world needs to see you." As she shook his hand, the grip was firm, and the understanding was final. He wasn't just giving her money, he was giving her the one thing she thought she'd lost the night she swapped those glasses: a future. She walked out of that office not as a waitress fleeing a ghost, but as a woman with the power to define her own destiny. The debt was paid, and the real story was just beginning. The white coat felt heavier than the red dress ever had, but it was a weight Laura Titi carried with pride. 5 years had passed since the night at the Sapphire Lounge, years spent in sterile libraries and grueling hospital shifts rather than dim VIP booths. As she walked through the lobby of the city's premier trauma center, the squeak of her clogs on the polished linoleum was the only sound that followed her. She wasn't a ghost anymore. She was Dr. Titi, the head of the surgical unit, a woman whose name meant the difference between life and death. A sleek black sedan pulled up to the ambulance bay, not an emergency, but a scheduled arrival. Laura stopped, her stethoscope draped around her neck like a silver medal, as the back door opened. Jin Woo stepped out. He looked exactly the same, yet entirely different. His features were still sharp enough to draw blood, and his presence still commanded the very air around him, but the lethal edge had been tempered by time. He wore a navy suit, tailored to perfection, and he moved with the relaxed grace of a man who no longer had to look over his shoulder every 3 seconds. He stopped a few feet away, his dark eyes scanning the Dr. Titi embroidery on her coat. A slow, respectful smile spread across his face, a look he reserved for very few people in this world. "I see you finally learned how to keep your head up," he said, His voice that same deep melodic rasp that still had the power to make her heart skip a beat. "It's easier to walk when you're not pretending to trip," Laura replied, a playful spark in her eyes. She didn't bow. She didn't look at the floor. She stood her ground, an absolute equal to the man who had once been her judge and executioner. "I heard about the operation you performed last night," Jin Woo said, stepping closer. "The papers are calling it a miracle. They say you saved a man the police had already given up on." "I just recognized the pattern," she said simply. "Sometimes you just have to know which glass to switch." They stood in the quiet morning light of the hospital entrance. Two people from two vastly different worlds who were bound by a single impossible moment of courage. Jin Woo reached into his pocket, but he didn't pull out a phone or a weapon. He pulled out a small, invitation-style card for a charity gala, a benefit for underprivileged medical students. "My foundation is hosting this," he said, handing it to her. "It would be an honor to have the city's finest surgeon as my guest, not as a waitress and not as someone I'm protecting, but as a friend." Laura took the card, her fingers brushing his. The spark of tension was still there, but the fear was long gone. "I think I can make time in my schedule, Jin Woo, but I'm not wearing a red dress." He chuckled, a low, warm sound. "Wear whatever you like, doctor. You've already proven you're the most dangerous person in any room." As he turned to get back into his car, he gave her one final, lingering nod, a salute from one survivor to another. Laura watched him drive away, then turned back toward the hospital doors. She had a ward to run, lives to save, and a future she had built with her own two hands. The invisible girl was gone, replaced by a woman who had saved a king, and in doing so, had finally crowned herself.